March 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The dawn mist hung heavy over the dark waters as German reconnaissance pilot Oberleutnant Klaus Richter banked his Fieseler Stork observation plane low over the American positions across from Düsseldorf. Through the morning haze, his trained eyes picked out what he'd been searching for. Hundreds of American vehicles clustered in the tree lines, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even from altitude. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces positioned in careful defensive arrays. His pulse quickened. He'd found them. 2 full divisions, he reported urgently into his radio, circling once more to confirm the sighting. Massed armor and infantry, coordinates as follows. Below him, German listening posts rotated their directional antennas, triangulating American radio transmissions that confirmed what the pilot was seeing. The crackling voices spoke of troop movements, equipment checks, the mundane chatter of an army preparing for assault. Every indicator pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans would strike here at this exact point along the Rhine. What Oberleutnant Richter couldn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the tanks weighing his mind with dread weighed only 93 pounds each. Inflatable rubber dummies carefully positioned in the pre-dawn darkness. The sounds echoing across the river valley weren't from diesel engines and clanking treads, but from 16-inch transcription discs spinning on turntables, the audio pumped through 500-pound speakers with a 15-mile range. The radio transmissions, scripted performances by actors in uniform, men who'd studied their army's own communications patterns so thoroughly they could replicate them perfectly. The German officer was staring at the greatest magic trick of World War II. 3 years earlier, Christmas Eve, 1943, London. Captain Ralph Ingersoll hunched over his desk in a cramped office, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling as he typed up what he knew most would consider an absurd proposal. The former celebrity journalist, once dubbed a prodigiously energetic egotist by the New York Times, was about to pitch something that belonged more in Hollywood than on a battlefield. A phantom army, a unit of deceivers who would impersonate entire divisions using nothing but rubber, paint, and audacity. His fingers paused over the keys. He'd been working with British intelligence for months, helping to mislead German generals about the upcoming D-Day landings. The British had shown him what deception could achieve, entire fake armies conjured from inflatable tanks and false radio traffic, leading Hitler to keep critical divisions away from Normandy, waiting for an invasion at Calais that would never come. But Ingersoll wanted to take it further. Not strategic deception planned months in advance from headquarters, but tactical deception right on the front lines. A mobile unit that could race from crisis point to crisis point, appearing wherever the real army needed breathing room. 1,000 men masquerading as 15,000, buying time with illusion while flesh and blood divisions maneuvered into position. He finished the memo and sent it to Washington, then leaned back with a wry smile. One of my more improbable dreams, he muttered to himself. 6 weeks later, the Pentagon approved it whole. Spring 1944. Somewhere in England, Private Jack Maisie stood in formation with 350 other soldiers, studying the unusual collection of men around him. They looked like no military unit he'd ever seen. The GI next to him had paint under his fingernails and a sketchbook tucked into his jacket. 3 men down the line was arguing about cubism. Behind him, someone was quietly humming a Brahms concerto. "Gentlemen," announced the officer addressing them, "you are now the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, and you've been selected for a highly classified assignment. You're going to become the visual deception element of a new unit called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops." Macy, an art student from Brooklyn, had enlisted specifically to join this unit. The Army had been recruiting from art schools. The regulations explicitly called for set designers, theatre people, movie people, artists. Men who could look at a landscape and imagine how to transform it, who understood perspective and shadow, who could make the fake look real from a mile up. But this was different from camouflage. "Your job," the officer continued, "will be to draw enemy fire. To make the Germans think entire divisions are where they're not. You'll be setting up fake tanks, fake artillery, fake command posts. You'll be positioning yourselves as targets. A stunned silence fell over the formation. "You mean?" someone finally asked. "We're asking for the enemy to fire on us?" "Yes." Private Gil Seltzer turned to the man next to him, his face pale. "We've just joined a suicide outfit. May 1944, an English countryside." Sergeant Victor Dowd pedaled his bicycle back to camp through the darkness, his mind still on the pretty British girl he'd just kissed goodnight. A light glowed inside his tent, unusual for this hour. He pushed aside the flap. "Who's there?" "Sergeant Dowd," he announced, parking his bicycle. "You'd better get in here," a voice called urgently. "Let me park my bike." One of the platoon wise guys laughed darkly. "You're not going to need your bike anymore." The next morning, Dowd found himself in a C-47 transport plane, skimming low over the English Channel. Through the window, the Normandy coast materialized through the morning mist. Omaha Beach, 8 days after D-Day. The metal mesh landing strip had been laid directly over sand still churned by the greatest amphibious invasion in history. When the plane's doors opened, the sweet rot smell of death hit him like a fist. Machine gun fire crackled in the distance. The fighting was still within earshot. Dead German soldiers lay scattered across the beach, their coal scuttle helmets and stick grenades already becoming symbols in his mind. He pulled out his sketchbook, hands trembling slightly, and drew them. A helmet, a potato masher grenade. "This," he whispered to himself, "symbolizes war." Lieutenant Bernie Mason's 15-man advance platoon had orders that seemed designed to get them killed. Set up dummy artillery positions a full mile ahead of the real guns, then wait for the Germans to shell them. Task Force Mason, they called themselves, with the dark humor of men who knew their assignment was to become bait. For 28 days they played their deadly game, inflating rubber artillery pieces under cover of darkness, maintaining them under German observation during daylight. The Germans took the bait, pounding their fake positions with high explosive and shrapnel, while the real 980th Artillery Battalion operated untouched behind them. Somehow, impossibly, none of them died. July 1944, the fields of France. The Ghost Army had landed in force now, nearly 1,000 strong, and was learning the peculiar art of military theatre. Private Arthur Shilstone stood guard duty one warm afternoon, when 2 French civilians on bicycles penetrated the perimeter. He raised his rifle to halt them, but their eyes weren't on him. They were staring over his shoulder, mouths agape. Shilstone turned to see what had captured their attention. 4 GIs casually picking up what appeared to be a 40-ton Sherman tank and rotating it to face a new direction. The Frenchman's eyes darted between the impossible scene and Shilstone's face, searching for answers, for sanity, for something that made sense. Shilstone cleared his throat. "The Americans," he said solemnly in his broken French, "are very strong." The deception demanded an artist's obsessive attention to detail. Private John Jarvie learned to position dummy equipment so it appeared hidden in plain sight, a turret barely visible behind a hedgerow, a gun barrel peeking from beneath camouflage netting. German reconnaissance pilots seeing 1 or 2 items would assume dozens more lay concealed. Combat engineers used bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into muddy roads. Spent artillery shells were scattered around inflatable guns to suggest recent firing. Everything had to look lived in, natural, real. And then there was what they called special effects. The human element. Why not stencil division markings on their trucks? Why not create a counterfeit shoulder patch factory, hand-painting replicas of whatever unit they were impersonating? Some patches came from the real divisions, others were lovingly crafted forgeries sewn onto their uniforms. "My shirts," recalled radio operator Stan Nance years later, "were all wrecked from having sewn so many different shoulder patches on them. We became seamstresses. They even violated army regulations by creating fake command posts staffed with fake commanders. Some sergeant would pin on 2 stars and swagger around town playing a major general, while other men in borrowed officers' insignia would get blitzed in local cafes, singing the favorite songs of whatever unit they were pretending to be. It was theater. Deadly serious theatre performed for an audience trained to kill actors who missed their marks. August 1944, the Siege of Brest. The port city of Brest remained in German hands, its garrison determined to deny the Allies a critical harbour. The Ghost Army received orders for what would become their most ambitious performance yet, Operation Brest, the first time they'd deploy all three deception methods simultaneously. Their mission, impersonate the entire 6th Armoured Division, drawing German reserves to the flanks while the real attack punched through the centre. Staff Sergeant Harold Dahl crouched in the back of his half-track as darkness fell, watching his crew prepare the speakers. They were positioning themselves only a few hundred yards from German lines, close enough to hear the enemy talking, close enough that a single German artillery observer with binoculars could call down fire that would obliterate them. At the signal, the speakers crackled to life. The recorded sounds of an armoured division moving into position thundered across the landscape, diesel engines revving, tank treads clanking against pavement, sergeants barking orders, the distinctive whine of turret motors rotating gun barrels. The audio engineers had captured it all at Fort Knox months earlier, working with Bell Labs specialists to create the earliest known example of multi-track recording. In nearby towns, trucks with hastily painted 6th Armoured markings drove endless loops through the streets. Radio operators mimicked the chatter of tank battalions. Dummy Shermans appeared on ridgelines, their rubber barrels pointed menacingly toward German positions. The Germans bought it completely. Captured officers later told interrogators they were absolutely convinced the 6th Armoured was there. But success had a bitter edge. An American tank battalion commander, unaware of the deception, launched his attack directly down the ravine where the Ghost Army's sonic trucks had been simulating a tank assembly area. German anti-tank guns that had been drawn by the false sounds opened up on the real tanks. Private Bob Tompkins watched in horror as the American armor was decimated before even reaching their line of departure. Those guys never reached the point where they wanted to start their attack from, he recalled decades later, his voice still haunted. They got slaughtered. We had no way of knowing they were going to kick off an attack, and they had no way of knowing we weren't going to help them. The victory felt hollow. Men had died because the deception worked too well. August 25th, 1944, Paris. The City of Light exploded with joy as Allied forces rolled through streets that had known 4 years of Nazi occupation. For one impossible week, the Ghost Army found itself stationed near Paris, and in the confusion of orders and counter-orders, the men discovered that the city was simultaneously off-limits and on-limits so often that everyone in confusion visited it whenever possible. Private Arthur Shilstone sketched in a cafe that was also a brothel, his pencil flying across paper as women in scanty costumes tried to entice soldiers upstairs. A woman named Doris perched on his table, glass of wine in one hand, cigarette in the other, wearing high heels and practically nothing else. "Come upstairs," she purred, in broken English. "You give me the drawing, you don't have to pay." Shilstone kept drawing, kept declining. When he finally stood to leave, he tucked the sketch carefully into his portfolio. He'd captured something worth more than an hour's transaction, a moment of strange beauty in the midst of war. Private Bill Blass, a 21-year-old from Fort Wayne, Indiana, spent his Paris leave differently. While other soldiers crowded into bars and brothels, Blass haunted fashion houses and magazine stands, filling his notebooks with designs for women's clothing. His uniform was always immaculate. "Leave it to Blass to have his pressed," recalled Jack Macy, and he read Vogue in his foxhole. His fellow soldiers thought he was peculiar. After the war, he'd become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. September 1944. The gap in Patton's line. General George S. Patton, Jr. stared at the map in his command post, his famous temper barely controlled. In his aggressive push toward the fortress city of Metz, a 70-mile gap had opened in his northern flank. If the Germans realized, if they probed that void and found nothing but air. "There is one rather bad spot in my line," he wrote to his wife that evening, his handwriting unusually shaky. "But I don't think the Huns know it. holding it now by the grace of God and a lot of guts. The Ghost Army raced north to plug the hole with nothing but rubber and lies. For 4 straight nights, sonic trucks operated along the Moselle River, so close to German positions that the crews could hear enemy soldiers calling to each other across the water. The speakers thundered with recordings of massive armor concentrations, tracks grinding through forests, sergeants screaming about light discipline, the mechanical symphony of an army that didn't exist. After a while, recalled Lieutenant Dick Syracuse, my eyes were beginning to tell me what my ears were hearing. I began to see tanks. They weren't there. They were in my ear. Radio operator Bob Conrad huddled in his truck, fingers flying across his telegraph key, broadcasting the scripted messages of a phantom armored division. There was nothing between us but our hopes and prayers, he remembered, that separated us from the Panzer Division across that river. Every hour increased the odds that German intelligence would see through the ruse. Every dawn brought the possibility of a probe in force that would discover the Emperor had no clothes, just 1,000 men with rubber tanks and speakers. 7 days. For 7 increasingly desperate days, the Ghost Army held that line alone. When the real 83rd Division finally arrived to take over, Patton's northern flank had held. The Germans never realized they'd been facing a stage production instead of an army. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Private Ned Harris stood guard duty in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath fogging in the brutal cold of the coldest winter in 40 years. The Ghost Army was positioned along a thinly held section of the Ardennes Forest, impersonating the 75th Infantry Division to make the Germans think the line was stronger than it was. At precisely midnight, orders came down to pull out immediately. No explanation, just move now. The convoy rolled south through falling snow, leaving their positions at 12:01 a.m. on December 16th. At 4 a.m., Hitler's legions unleashed the largest German offensive of the war on the Western Front, smashing directly into the sector the Ghost Army had just evacuated. What would become famous as the Battle of the Bulge had begun. If we'd have been there, Private George Bio recalled, still shaken decades later, there'd be no 23rd. Staff Sergeant Spike Berry didn't learn about the attack until he drove into the town of Bastogne on a routine errand to return a movie reel. The place was deserted. No film library, no headquarters, nobody. He found a single military police sergeant standing in the town square. "What's going on here?" Berry asked. "What the hell are you doing here?" The MP shot back. "I'm returning a movie film." "You're returning what?" The MP stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Listen, sir, you get that Thompson submachine gun that's in your leather holster along your spare tire, and you and your driver get the hell out of town. Now." Berry left Bastogne at high speed. Within hours, the 101st Airborne would be surrounded there, earning immortality for their stand. Back in Luxembourg City, Ghost Army soldiers manned rooftop machine guns as Luftwaffe fighters strafed the streets, the only time during the war they'd actually fire weapons at the enemy. Lieutenant Bernie Mason received orders to rig all their vehicles with explosive charges in case they had to destroy their equipment to prevent it from falling into German hands. That, he remembered, was kind of scary. The men who'd spent months advancing toward Germany now found themselves retreating, packed into trucks rolling through a snowstorm toward the rear. Private Jack Maisie couldn't process what was happening. "Victory looks like it's in sight," he muttered to the soldier next to him. "The Allies are pushing like crazy." "Then whammo, pack up, we're going, the Germans are coming." I said, "What do you mean the Germans are coming? Isn't the war over?" As they fled Luxembourg, Maisie watched American flags being lowered from buildings, swastika banners being quietly raised in their place. The pragmatic survival instinct of a population that had been conquered too many times. They ended up in Verdun, camping in the same World War I fortifications where more than 500,000 men had died 3 decades earlier. For Christmas, someone cut a tree and decorated it with inflated condoms as balloons and stars cut from tin cans. Private Victor Dowd sketched Polish refugee children, trying to make them smile, failing with one little boy whose eyes had seen too much. "God knows what he'd been through," Dowd whispered. That was Christmas 1944. March 12, 1945, somewhere in Germany. The shell hit 30 feet in front of Sergeant Dowd's truck. He sat frozen behind the wheel, watching it explode in a fountain of earth and shrapnel. The next shell screamed overhead and detonated behind them, hitting the vehicle in their convoy. Men were screaming. Blood. Limbs. The proof that their deceptions worked was written in American casualties. The Germans were firing on them because they believed the Ghost Army was real. 2 men killed, 15 wounded, their deadliest day of the war. Dowd thought about the word luck as medics worked frantically on the wounded. Wrong place, you're dead. Right place, you live to old age. There was no logic to it, no fairness, just the random mathematics of artillery trajectories and flesh. March 24th, 1945. Operation Viersen. The Rhine River. Captain Ralph Ingersoll stood on a hill overlooking the staging area for what would be the Ghost Army's final performance. Below him, 1,100 deceivers were executing the most complex operation in the unit's history, making the Germans believe that 30,000 American soldiers were massing for an attack 10 miles from where the real assault would come. The stakes couldn't be higher. British General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group was about to force the Rhine, Hitler's last natural barrier. 2 divisions of the American 9th Army, the 30th and 79th, would lead one wing. But first, the Germans had to be looking the wrong way. For days, the Ghost Army had been building their masterpiece. Hundreds of inflatable tanks arranged in perfect military precision around the towns of Anrath and Dolken. Real armoured vehicles mixed with the fakes to enhance the illusion. Farmyards transformed into repair depots, forests converted into motor pools. They'd even created fake airfields with inflatable L-5 observation planes, so convincing that a real pilot mistakenly landed at one and had to be hurriedly waved off. At the pre-assigned moment, radio operators for the real divisions went silent. Ghost Army operators seamlessly took over their frequencies, creating the electronic illusion that those divisions were traveling to the fake attack point. German signals intelligence, confident they could identify individual American radio operators by their fist, their unique telegraph sending style, missed the switch. The Ghost Army's radio men were that good. As darkness fell on March 23rd, sonic trucks moved to within a few hundred yards of German positions along the Rhine. The sounds of pontoon bridges being assembled echoed across the water, hammering, swearing, the splash of sections being floated into position. The audio was so realistic that American soldiers hearing it believed engineers were actually working. At 2 a.m. on March 24th, Navy landing craft began crossing the Rhine at the real assault point, 10 miles from where the Ghost Army had been performing. The infantrymen aboard those craft braced for hell. The Germans had sworn the Rhine would run red with American blood. Every soldier knew the next few minutes might be his last. Instead, they found weak, disorganized resistance, scattered fire, confused defenders who seemed to be expecting the attack somewhere else. The deception had worked. US Army casualties were so light they would almost have that many casualties if they were running a big training exercise, recalled one officer. Captured German maps showed the 79th Division exactly where the Ghost Army had portrayed it, 10 miles from where it actually was. There is no doubt, concluded the official intelligence report, that Operation Viersen materially assisted in deceiving the enemy with regard to the real dispositions and intentions of this army. General William Simpson, commander of the 9th Army, wrote a letter of commendation calling the operation an important part of the crossing's success, reflecting great credit on this unit. It was the final performance of the Ghost Army. The Rhine was behind them. The war in Europe had weeks left to run.